Hey, welcome back. We're doing part 2 of Find Player 2. I'm gonna try to get the whole story done today, so I think part 2 should be out very soon as well, or part 3 should be out very soon as well. And the citrate user I already did that first this time, so I think we're almost done. Crazy. How the time flies. Okay, let's get back to Find Player 2. So where we last left off, Amy had left Mary Jo behind in this sort of hiding maze in Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. And the reason for that is because she saw this creepy guy who was staring at them both earlier. Weird. We don't really know who he is yet, but possibly William Afton. I guess we'll see. And now there's been a time skip to, I believe, 10 years later, and it's not entirely clear what happened to Mary Jo, but probably nothing good. So I guess we'll see. Amy shifted so she could see herself in the full-length mirror beside her dresser. She'd seen photos of herself at 11 years old, and she didn't think she looked a lot different now. She was small and skinny then, and she was petite and slender now. Obviously, her face looked a little different because now she wore makeup, but the slight slant of her eyes and severe arch of her brows, the upturned nose, and the slightly pouty mouth were the same. In the photos she'd seen of her younger self, Amy's long blonde hair had usually been held back in a ponytail or a braid. That was still how she wore her hair. What would Mary Jo look like now? Would her hair still stick out from her head? Would her smile still be as big? At first, Amy liked to tell herself that she never saw Mary Jo again after that day in the hiding maze because Mary Jo got mad and ran away. It was a reasonable conclusion. Mary Jo had often threatened to run away, and she'd always had that backpack with her, ready to go. But years later, when Amy was being honest with herself, it was pretty clear that Mary Jo hadn't run anywhere. Amy's dream told her that. The reoccurring dream, no, not a dream, a nightmare, that had been telling Amy the truth for 10 years. Amy pulled away from her reflection and lay back on her bed. She forced herself to travel into the past. As she had done literally thousands of times now, Amy tried to convince herself there was no way she could have known something bad would happen to Mary Jo when Amy left the hiding maze. Even though she'd been afraid of the creepy guy, Amy's 11-year-old mind hadn't really believed he found Mary Jo and hurt her. And since then, she'd tried very hard to believe that Mary Jo was never seen again because of something else, something that had nothing to do with Amy. But in truth, Amy knew that she was, in part, responsible. Just in part, though. The true culprit was the creep Amy had seen in the arcade and at the entrance of the hiding maze right before she left it. The evening of the day she'd last seen Mary Jo, Amy had also seen the creep on TV. He'd been arrested for the attempted kidnapping of some other kid. She didn't normally pay attention when her parents watched the news, but she'd seen the guy's face and she'd heard his name. Emmett Tucker. She'd also heard the word kidnapping. Okay, well there goes the William Afton theory. Maybe he's still a parallel. I guess we'll see. When she'd heard that word, her stomach had turned into a rock that dropped all the way to her feet. When it was clear Mary Jo had disappeared, Amy just knew that creep had taken her friend. He'd taken her and he must have killed her. Apparently the police were never able to prove that he did, so the guy just went to some prison for the attempted kidnapping of the other kid. Amy took some comfort in that, but not knowing exactly what happened to Mary Jo ate away at her. For years after Mary Jo disappeared, Amy had carried guilt like a backpack even heavier than Mary Jo's. She'd known the creepy guy was poking around the hiding maze, and she'd left her friend there. She was sure that Emmett Tucker had taken Mary Jo, and it was Amy's fault. Just a few months after Mary Jo disappeared, Amy and her family had moved to another state. Long before the time they left, actually just a couple weeks after the last time Amy saw Mary Jo, the Freddy's where Amy and Mary Jo had played in the hiding maze had closed. Amy was never sure why. Her mother thought Freddy's closed because it was inherently unsafe for children. She never thought the animatronics were a good idea. Amy's mom was very upset that the town they moved to also had a Freddy's. She didn't have to worry, though. Amy never went to it. It reminded her too much of Mary Jo. But last week, her mom had called her, interrupting the cramming Amy was doing for her commercial transactions class. Stepping out of the library and into the cool night to take her mom's call, Amy had looked up at the stars as she said with a sigh, "I'm studying, Mom." "I know you are, sweetie, but I just wanted to check in on you. How's it going?" "Fine, Mom, but I do need to concentrate." I know, I just thought you could take a break and chat for a few minutes." Amy's mom's smooth and deep voice broke into a chuckle. "You know, a few seconds for your dear old mom." Amy sighed. Through the phone, she could hear footsteps tapping on hardwood floors. She could picture her mom pacing back and forth in the kitchen. That's what her mom always did when she was chatting on the phone. Amy could see her mom's lovely face as if she was right there. Blonde and blue-eyed like Amy, but with more classical features, her mom had large eyes, high cheekbones, and a full mouth. "What do you want to chat about? You have 2 minutes. Go." Her mom laughed. "Okay, I'll start the kitchen timer. Well, let's see. Your dad has taken up racquetball. It might be too much for him. His shoulders and arms are so sore he can barely lift his coffee cup." Amy smiled. "Oh, and I saw a blurb on the news about that man we thought took Mary Jo. Remember him?" Remember him? How could she not? Amy felt all her muscles contract at once, as they always did whenever she thought about Freddy's or Emmett Tucker. "What about him?" "Oh, they let him out of prison. For good behavior or some such nonsense. He's back in his home, free as a bird. For some reason, I've never forgotten about him. Probably because of Mary Jo." Amy felt her stomach flip over and try to crawl up her esophagus. She thought she was going to be sick. Mary Jo's kidnapper was free? "Amy, are you there?" her mom asked. Amy tried to talk, and the words caught in her throat. She swallowed and managed, "Yeah, Mom, has he talked to the press or anything?" "What? I have no idea. I just saw a little report about him, that's all." "I have to go, Mom." Amy practically threw the words at her mother, and she didn't wait for a response. She ran inside the library, straight to the bathroom, where she threw up. After sitting in the bathroom stall and crying for half an hour, she'd forced herself not to think about what her mom told her. She had to study and take the exam. But of course she'd thought about it. She'd been thinking about it for a week now. Even so, she'd made sure it didn't mess up her studying, because before she went back to cramming the night her mom called, she made a decision. As soon as she graduated, she was going to go back to the town where she spent the first 11 years of her life. She was going back, and she was going to find out what Emmett Tucker did with Mary Jo. 10 years of uncertainty couldn't turn into 15 or 20 or more. Amy could no longer live with the assumption that Mary Jo had been kidnapped by Tucker without proving that he really did kidnap her and finding out what he did to her friend. She needed to know where he put Mary Jo's body. Amy was tired of the nightmares and the horrible visions that played over and over in her head. She was also tired of trying to delude herself with the idea that Mary Jo had run on and was living happily ever after somewhere. She was going to discover and prove the truth once and for all. Amy remembered her hometown as a pretty little place. Hugging both sides of a river that flowed out of the nearby mountains, the town was the home of a billionaire who had built his corporation's headquarters here. The headquarters, designed to look like an old-time western town, sprawled along the river on one end of the town. That's where both Amy's parents had worked. When the billionaire had a new complex with a more modern design built a few states away, probably so he could have a warmer place to visit in the winter, her parents were transferred. Amy had never really grown to like the new state. Too hot for her, and she missed snow in the winters. If it wasn't for Mary, or actually the absence of Mary Jo, Amy would have probably applied for a job at the corporate headquarters here in her old hometown. But she knew she couldn't handle living in a place that would remind her of her friend every day. Instead, she'd taken a job in a town a couple of 100 miles from here. It had the same climate, but no painful memories. Amy pulled her cute little red hybrid compact into the parking lot at the Riverside Motel just before sunset. When she turned off the engine, she tapped the steering wheel a couple times. Should she go now or wait until tomorrow? She squinted up beyond the motel's redwood siding and river rock-covered pillars. A reddish sun was sinking toward the glacier-topped ridge to the west. Almost blood-red rays painted the white expanses. Amy shivered. Tomorrow. What she needed to do could definitely wait until tomorrow. Amy looked away from the sunset. She turned and grabbed a bright yellow sweater from the back seat. Slipping it on, she picked up her purse and got out of the car. It took Amy only minutes to check into the motel and find her room. Once there, she perched atop the beige coverlet on the queen-size bed. She was facing a mirror above the low pine dresser sitting against the exposed log wall opposite the end of the bed. "Well, here you are," she said to herself. The mirror version of Amy spoke at the same time she did, of course. Still, she had trouble recognizing herself. She looked older in this mirror, like she was pushing 40 instead of barely getting to know 21. Why did her complexion look so gray, her cheeks so gaunt? Amy raised a hand to her face and brushed a few strands of hair from her eyes. It felt like a stranger was touching her. How odd. A tremor skittered down Amy's spine, and she looked away from the mirror. She needed sleep was all. She'd studied hard for most of 4 weeks, and over the last 3 days, she'd partied just as hard. Amy didn't have a ton of friends, but the ones she had were close ones. One of them, Greta, was Amy's closest friend since Mary Jo. She had super wealthy parents and lived in a mansion with a pool, tennis courts, a huge movie room, an equally large game room, and a massive ballroom. After exams were over, Greta's parents threw Greta and her friend a 3-day party, complete with live music and food catered by the best chef in town. Greta and Amy had spent so much of that time alone in the movie room binging old romantic comedies. They both loved the quiet solitude, but they'd balanced it with plenty of swimming, dancing, and eating. Amy had been friends with Greta since she and her parents had moved to the new state. She'd gone to junior high, high school, and college with Greta. Greta was the opposite of Mary Jo, a better match for Amy than Mary Jo ever was. When Amy had met Greta, she'd realized her mother's theory about friendship and balance had been a bunch of crap. Amy and Mary Jo hadn't been friends because they balanced each other out. They'd been friends because Amy had been too shy to tell Mary Jo to go jump in the river. Mary Jo had decided they were best friends, and Amy had gone along with it. From that point on, everything had always been about Mary Jo. As long as they were together, they were doing what Mary Jo wanted. The only time Amy had gotten to be herself was when she was literally by herself. Greta had been the person who had helped Amy figure this out. Greta was graduating with a BA in psychology, and she was going on to get a master's next. She wanted to be a therapist. Amy was one of her unofficial practice patients. Just the day before, as they'd floated in Greta's parents' infinity pool, looking out over perfectly trimmed expanses of green lawn and pruned bushes, Greta had said, "You realize that you don't need to find out exactly what happened to Mary Jo to get closure, right?" Amy, who'd been sipping lemonade from a huge covered tumbler balanced on her flat belly, shook her head and smacked her lips at the tartness of the drink. "Yeah, I do." Greta shook a head full of short curls. A stunning red-headed beauty with flawless pale skin, green eyes, and model-worthy features, Greta was surprisingly unconcerned about her looks. She rarely wore makeup, and she cut her own hair, despite being able to afford the most expensive hairdresser in town. She wasn't particularly good at haircutting, so her curls were always asymmetrical. "No, you don't," Greta said. "The only thing you need to do is forgive yourself. That's it. Easy peasy. One step, the end." Amy shook her head, and Greta splashed water on her. Amy closed her eyes just in time, and after the water cascaded over her sweaty shoulders and arms, she kept her eyes closed. With her sight taking a mini-vacation, Amy's other senses stepped up. She could smell Greta's coconut-scented sunscreen, the lemon in her lemonade, and the chlorine in the water. She could hear the water, too. It lapped lazily against their floating loungers and splashed against the sides of the pool. From the tennis courts, the thwack of rackets hitting tennis balls drifted over. From even farther away, the soothing sound of horses' neighs reached Amy's ears from the pasture. Amy took a deep breath, inhaling all this peacefulness. Then she said, "It's not as easy as you say it is. Mary Jo is missing because I left her in that game. I didn't warn her. I didn't tell an adult. I just left her right where that man could take her." Greta smacked the water with her hand. The sharp sound made Amy flinch and open her eyes. "God, you're so stubborn. How many times do I need to tell you that you don't know that?" Greta asked. "You're not dumb enough to think that. You don't know what happened after you left. You don't know what she did after she left the game. Probably some choice Mary Jo made led to her disappearance. Your choice had nothing to do with it." "But Emmett Tucker," Amy began. Greta held up a hand. "Tucker Schmucker, you don't know for sure that he took Mary Jo, and neither did the police. And if he didn't take her, then why is Mary Jo's disappearance your fault? I mean, I get it. You feel like your choice was responsible because it was such a huge deal for you. It's not Mary Jo's disappearance that marks that day for you. It's you standing up for yourself that makes the day so important. That was the first time you defied her, right? That's what you've always told me." Amy nodded. She and Greta had been through all this many times, but Greta was right. Amy was stubborn. It was hard to disconnect her act of defiance with the end of Mary Jo, and therefore it was hard not to blame herself for Mary Jo's disappearance. "But I didn't really defy her," Amy said. "Not directly, anyway." Greta opened her mouth, and this time Amy held up her hand. "You make it sound like I was making this big, self-empowering statement that day when I left her in the game, but the truth is, I was just being a scared, petulant child. I mean, if I was going to actually stand up to Mary Jo, I would have told her no. I would have said, 'I don't want to play in the hiding maze, I'm going home to read.' I didn't do that. I did something that left her vulnerable, and now that Emmett Tucker is out of prison..." She shrugged. "Because of that, you're filling your head with horrible images, imagining what he might have done to your friend, and you're heaping even more guilt on yourself. I know that the way you took your stand with Mary Jo was passive-aggressive, but you need to cut yourself some slack. You were 11 years old. Psychological mastery isn't a requirement for that age." Greta winked at Amy, and Amy smiled. "You're a good friend," Amy said. "So are you, and you were a good friend to Mary Jo, too. You owe her nothing." Amy twisted her lips. Greta sighed. "But you're still going back." Amy nodded. "I have to. I really do have to." Greta was quiet for several seconds. Inside the house, the band started playing again. So much for peacefulness. The bass was so strong it vibrated the surface of the water in the pool. I could still go with you. I meant it when I said I'd be happy to come, Greta shouted over a screeching guitar riff. I know, but I need to do this by myself. In her motel room, Amy lay back on her bed as the image of her friend and the relaxing pool faded away. Now that she was here, she was really wishing Greta had come with her. It would have been so much easier with Greta along, maybe even fun. They could have turned it into a celebration of everything they had to look forward to in the coming years. They could have... Amy frowned and derailed that train of thought. This trip wasn't about having fun or celebrating, it was about finding out, once and for all, what exactly had happened to Mary Jo. Amy hadn't told her parents or Greta exactly what she planned to do. Amy knew that they would have tried to talk her out of it. She could just hear her mother telling her how dangerous the idea was. But Amy didn't think it was all that dangerous. Well, maybe a little, but she thought she could handle it. Sure, when Amy had been a little girl, Tucker was scary, but now, Amy was more than capable of handling herself. She was strong and athletic, and she'd taken self-defense classes. Plus, she had both mace and a pretty blue taser in her purse. And she had her determination. She was going to find out what Tucker did one way or another. Besides, Tiger was more than likely a wuss. He took little kids, not adults. He wouldn't know what to do with someone who could fight back. Or at least that's what Amy told herself as she headed to Bernadette's Bakery on Main Street. Before Amy came back to face Emmett Tucker, she read the newspaper article about his release. The article had featured a photo of Tucker sitting in front of Bernadette's Bakery. A little research had revealed that though the bakery served tourists and locals alike, it was a favorite of longtime residents. Hoping Tucker was a regular, Amy figured the bakery was a good place to start her search for him. Bernadette's was one of the couple long dozen established businesses in the heart of town. The little downtown area was built around a brick-covered square with a stone fountain and a rose garden, and Bernadette's was the shop closest to the fountain. Amy found a parking space 2 doors down from Bernadette's and got out of her car. Slipping her long purse strap over her head so the purse hung across her body, she pulled her sweater tight and headed toward Bernadette's pale yellow storefront. Several pigeons strutted back and forth in front of Bernadette's, snatching pastry crumbs from under the little metal tables on the patio. It was chilly this morning, and only a couple old guys sat at the tables. When Amy had arrived in town the previous evening, the sun had been setting in a clear sky. Today, the sun was taking a little vacation. A froth of gray clouds churned above the town like the balloons that had floated on the ceiling of Greta's family's ballroom a couple days before. Those balloons, though, had been purple, not gray. And they'd promised happy times. The clouds overhead didn't seem to promise anything good. For some reason, Amy found them ominous. Get a grip, she muttered to herself as she pulled open the bakery's bright blue door. Bernadette's interior, thankfully, was warm, and it smelled of cinnamon, sugar, and coffee. Cramped and cute and frilly, the place didn't strike Amy as one that would appeal to the likes of Emmett Tucker. She looked around to see if he was here. He wasn't, but she figured she might as well hang out a bit and see if he showed up. The bakery's half-dozen rickety wood tables were occupied mostly by plaid-attired locals, but a few stylishly dressed tourists were in the mix. Every table seat was taken, but a tall counter along one wall had a couple empty stools. Amy approached the service counter and waited behind a tall woman ordering 3 dozen assorted pastries. While she waited, Amy turned and watched out the window, her muscles tensed, her gaze darting around, scanning the street for Emmett Tucker. Tucker didn't show up when Amy watched, but he did eventually appear. Amy had been nursing a small latte and nibbling on a cinnamon roll for 10 minutes, wondering if she was wasting her time. Maybe she should have gone to the county records office and tried to find Tucker's residence. She was glancing at her watch for the 5th time when Bernadette's door swung open and Emmett Tucker walked in. Amy knew Emmett Tucker had been in his early 40s when he was arrested. He looked much older than that, but several things had contributed to the wrinkles that lined his face. He'd apparently spent most of his adult life working outside on construction sites and was also a chain smoker. Amy figured he probably ate junk food too. He didn't look like someone who bought organic vegetables. Now, with his long hair gone, replaced by a buzz cut, Tucker was barely recognizable as the man he'd been when Amy had seen him at Freddy's and on the news. But she knew him. Those eyes and those yellowed teeth were unmistakable. Sometime in the last 10 years, Tucker had picked up a scar that bisected his left cheek, and he lost a few of his teeth. Interesting. Wonder if that'll come into play later. Also, this does sound like it could be a William Afton parallel. Late 40s when he was arrested. That lines up. Yellow teeth. I mean, in the graphic novels, he's mentioned to have those. He had longer hair, I believe, when he was younger. Before all the kidnappings, I think. Not like super long hair, but I don't know. Maybe I'm looking into this too much. No one greeted Tucker when he came into the bakery. The tourists didn't give him a glance. The locals flicked looks at him, but they quickly returned their attention to their coffee and rolls. Tucker didn't seem to care one way or another about who was paying attention to him. He just ordered his coffee and cinnamon roll and headed back outside. Amy half rose off her stool when he went out the door, but she sat down when Tucker settled himself at an outside table and proceeded to drink his coffee and eat his cinnamon roll as if it was a warm, sunny day. For 20 minutes, Amy tapped her foot and sipped at the dregs of her cooling latte. Should she confront him now? That would probably be smart. But then again, maybe if she just followed him, she'd learn something about him that would make a confrontation unnecessary. She gritted her teeth. She should wait. When Tucker finally rose from his table, Amy stood and dropped her styrofoam cup and paper plate in a trash bin by the door as she watched Tucker head north up the street. Before he could get out of sight, she exited the bakery and lingered by its tables as she watched Tucker angle off the sidewalk toward the driver's side of a faded old green van. A van. That was suspicious. Didn't kidnappers use vans? Amy trotted quickly to her car and got in just as Tucker backed the van out of the angled parking spot in front of an art gallery. She quickly started her car and pulled out to follow him. For the next hour, Amy tailed Tucker to a pharmacy where he picked up a prescription, to a gas station where he put gas in a van, and finally to a grocery store where he filled a cart with frozen dinners, chips, canned soup, cereal, and a gallon of milk. She was right about his lack of interest in organic vegetables. He didn't go anywhere near the produce aisle, period. Amy's heart rate had been fast and uneven when she started stalking her quarry, but by the time she got to the grocery store, it had settled down. It turned out that stalking wasn't all that interesting, at least not when your target was doing mundane things. It wasn't hard either. At first, Amy had been furtive. At the pharmacy, she'd hidden behind a display of sunglasses, and she'd even pretended to try on a few pairs as she'd have a disguise. At the gas station, she'd pulled her car in behind a dumpster and gotten out to peer over the top of it while Tucker pumped his gas. In the grocery store, at first, she hid behind product displays at the ends of the aisles, but when it became obvious that Tucker was oblivious to his surroundings, she gave up the subterfuge and just followed him around. She did have a card, so she looked like a normal shopper, and she threw a little of this and a little of that in the cart, but she shouldn't have bothered. He never even looked her way. After Tucker got back in his van in the grocery store parking lot, he headed out of town and turned a narrow rural road. She let a car get between her and Tucker just in case he noticed her, not that she thought he would. The town was filled with small hybrids similar to hers. As she drove, Amy kept her gaze on the roof of the van up ahead of her. It trundled along at a sedate pace, so it was easy to keep up. At one point, a loud caw startled her, and she flinched when a crow swooped low across the hood of her car, barely avoiding her windshield. Rattled for reasons she didn't understand, she watched the crow fly over a dormant cornfield. Going this slowly, Amy had plenty of time to survey her surroundings. The rural road was winding through the flatlands stretching out from the south side of town to the foothills of the distant mountains. A lot of this area was farmland, but she remembered there were a couple parks out this way, farther down the road. Along this stretch of the narrow, uneven road, though, neither farms nor parks were visible. Instead, dilapidated old mobile homes and deteriorating cottages with roofs succumbing to thick moss were surrounded by old cars up on cinder blocks and discarded furniture. Amy spotted several broken trampolines, multiple rusting swings, and dozens of scattered toys left out in scruffy yards to be baked by the sun and drowned in the rain. After about 5 minutes, Tucker's van slowed and Tucker turned left next to a dented mailbox on a slanted wood post. Dust billowed up from the van's tires as he headed down a dirt driveway. Amy slowed and looked past the van. The driveway appeared to stop in front of an old mobile home. This must be where Tucker lived. Amy drove past the driveway and pulled off the road a couple hundred yards further on. She parked at the road's gravel shoulder and looked back over her shoulder. Yep, sure enough, Tucker was unloading his groceries and heading toward the mobile home's front door. Amy slapped her hand on the steering wheel in celebration. This was her chance. She could finally confront him. A tiny flutter in Amy's belly might have been suggesting that she was doing something that wasn't all that smart, but she ignored it. She didn't care about being smart right now. She cared about finding out what Emmett Tucker had done with Mary Jo. Amy did a tight U-turn on the narrow road. Returning to Tucker's driveway, she turned onto it. Amy's little car bumped through a pothole. She clenched her teeth and slowed the car to a crawl. Peering through her now dusty windshield, Amy looked at her destination. A chill sluiced through her. Maybe this wasn't such a good idea. Emmett Tucker's home looked as if it wasn't a fit place for rats, much less humans. Sitting in the middle of a small rectangle of bare dirt relieved only by the occasional wilted weed, the single wide was either painted dark brown or it was so dirty it had become dark brown over time, and its windows were so caked with dust they were barely recognizable as windows. 2 of them were boarded over. The flashing around the base of the mobile home had long since torn away, and the rusted wheels of the home's undercarriage could be seen balancing on crumbling cinder blocks. Reaching the barren earth in front of Tucker's home, Amy did another U-turn and parked her car with its front end pointed toward the road. She wanted to be in a position for a quick getaway if needed. Glancing in her rearview mirror to see if Tucker had come back outside, he hadn't. Amy grabbed her purse and got out of the car before she could change her mind. Looking up at the dark sky, she slung her purse across her body. She unsnapped the purse and kept her hand inside, tightly grasping her taser. Then she pointed herself toward Tucker's front door and marched over to it with her chin lifted and her shoulders set. She was just stepping up onto the rotting porch when the black-painted front door swung open. She started to a stop and forced herself not to backpedal. She looked into the eyes of the man she'd seen in Freddy's 10 years before. "Whatever you're selling, I'm not buying," Emmett Tucker said. Up close, he looked even worse than he had in the bakery. His skin was so thin you could see his veins crawling under the surface. Amy didn't want to be here any longer than she had to be, so she got right to the point. Clutching her mace and planting her feet, she recited her prepared lines. 10 years ago, my friend Mary Jo and I saw you at Freddy's. That was the same day you were arrested. It was also the same day Mary Jo disappeared. I want to know what you did with her."
But first, this video is sponsored by the Elementia Studios Patreon. If you feel like supporting the channel for only $1 a month, check it out. The link will be in the description.
Tucker blinked once and leaned against the door jamb. Slowly, he reached into the sagging pocket of his baggy jeans. Amy stiffened and tightened her grip on the taser. Tucker pulled out a pack of chewing gum and methodically unwrapped a piece. Folding it into his mouth, he tossed the wrapper onto the porch. "I quit smoking," he said. "Good for you," Amy said without thinking. Tucker leaned back and gestured toward the interior of the mobile home. "Want to come in?" Amy bit back her hell no and said politely, "No thank you, I'm fine out here." She swallowed. "I realize you probably won't answer my question. Why would you? You never admitted to anything before, but I had to come and ask. I had to." For several seconds, Tucker chewed his gum loudly. The sucking and smacking sound made Amy's skin crawl. Then Tucker took a step forward. Amy backed away quickly. Tucker chuckled at her, then gestured at the porch step. "I tell you what, you sit here with me, all neighborly-like, for a spell, and I'll answer your question." Amy frowned and looked at the porch. She glanced back up and saw that Tucker's gaze had dropped from her face to her fitted scoop-neck pale blue top and on down to her tight navy blue pencil pants. Amy kept her expression neutral. She didn't like being stared at by anyone. She didn't like it, but she'd learned to ignore it. She wasn't going to let Tucker intimidate her. She looked down at the porch again. She realized she was inspecting it for some kind of hidden trap. Why did he want her to sit with him? She shrugged. Okay, if that was what it was going to take. "You first," Amy said, gesturing at the step. Tucker chuckled again and sank down onto the splintered wood planks. Amy followed suit, positioning herself out of his reach. She kept her grip on the taser. For several seconds they sat in silence. In the distance a dog barked once. A truck rumbled past on the road. The breeze picked up and the sky seemed to lower even more. "Well?" Amy said. Tucker turned to look at her. "I remember you. You and that girl everyone thought I took were in Freddy's that day." Amy forced herself not to shiver. Tucker cocked his head. "You were the one I saw in that tunnel thing when I was looking for my daughter." Amy could feel her pulse throbbing double time at her temples. She kept her breathing even. Tucker shrugged. "That's why I was there that day. I was looking for Jilly, my daughter. She always liked going to that place." He turned abruptly and shifted closer to Amy. She pulled her mace halfway out of her purse, but she didn't lean back. Instead, she looked directly into Tucker's eyes. "And where did you take my friend?" Tucker chewed his gum and held Amy's gaze for several seconds. Then he shook his head. "I never took any kid. All I was trying to do when I got arrested was get my own kid back from that lying tramp I married. So what if she's got custody? Why does a court get to decide who gets custody of a man's daughter? That judge had no business giving my girl to my ex. It was my right to have my own kid. I was just standing up for my rights. I never should have been sent to prison for that." Tucker pounded his fist in the porch, and Amy jumped up. "You're lying!" Tucker scowled at her. "Who the hell are you coming to my home and telling me I'm lying?" He stood and Amy took a step back. "Get out of here! I've had enough of folks thinking I did stuff I didn't do." "Tell the truth," Amy yelled. "You took Mary Jo. I know you did. She yelled at you and so you took her. You took her and you killed her." Tucker's face flushed red. "Why the hell would I care if some little snot kid yelled at me? I didn't take your stupid friend. I never killed anyone." Amy pulled out her taser and aimed it at Tucker's chest. "Tell me the truth or I'll tase you." All the anger and frustration and guilt she'd hung on to for 10 years came out in the screeched words and spittle that flew from her mouth. Tucker jerked forward and reached for the taser. Amy didn't hesitate. She pressed the button. Tucker whipped his body away so the taser missed him. When it did, he started cussing. "What the hell's wrong with you?" he bellowed. He swung out at her. Amy zigged away from his blow and then stepped in before he could swing again. Furious, she kicked him in the shin. Ow! Tucker glared at Amy, bent over and charged at her. Feeling pleased with herself for hurting Tucker, Amy wasn't ready for Tucker's move. She tried to avoid him, but he grabbed her. She screamed and attempted to slip a hand into her purse to get her mace. But Tucker had her in a bear hug, and he tightened it. Then he lifted her off the ground. Crazy girl, he growled at her as he backed toward his open front door. Let me go, Amy spewed as she flailed in Tucker's grip. She tried to remember her self-defense moves. What was she supposed to do when someone held her tight like this? Her heart pounding, sweat trickling down her spine, Amy remembered. She threw her head up, trying to whack Tucker's chin. All she did was whap her forehead into his chest. She was too short to do him any harm that way. By this time, Tucker was carrying her inside his dingy home, and Amy's fury was turning into fear. She writhed this way and that, but she couldn't break loose, so she started to scream. Shut the hell up, Tucker shouted. He carried her past a filthy kitchenette and into a tight, dark hallway that smelled like dirty laundry and cooked sausages. Amy picked up her feet and tried to kick at the walls, but the space was too cramped. She screamed again, and Tucker kicked a small door open and tossed her through the opening. Amy's hip hit the corner of a miniature bathroom cabinet, and her head flew forward and hit a small mirror. Wincing, she struggled for balance and turned to face Tucker, just as he slammed the door. I'm calling the police, Tucker yelled through the cheap wood. Good, Amy yelled back. You should be in prison. I'm not the one going to prison, Tucker shouted. You assaulted me. Amy opened her mouth to yell as a response, but then she realized he was right. But it was self-defense, wasn't it? Of course it was. She tased him because he reached out at her. Reached out. Okay, so maybe that wasn't enough for her to claim self-defense. But he was a kidnapper. Yeah, of kids. Amy rubbed her sore hip and tried to steady her breathing. It refused to steady. She was taking heavy gulps of air. Through the door she could hear Tucker talking on the phone. She caught the words crazy girl and assault. She shook her head. She couldn't let the police get involved in this. They might arrest her. And even if they didn't, she'd waste all kinds of time trying to get it all straightened out. No, she had to get out of here. Amy reached out and tried the doorknob. Locked, not a surprise. She thought about throwing herself at the door, but she quickly dismissed that idea and turned to look at the room. She was in a minuscule bathroom, a very disgusting bathroom with toothpaste drying on the sides of the sink, a brown ring around the grayish tub, and stains she didn't want to think about. She had to get out of here. She looked out the window of the bathroom. A bush lay down below. It could break her fall. She geared up to jump out the window and took a deep breath before doing so. Oh boy, she's escaping, it seems. I guess we'll have to see where that goes, because I think this has been going on for a while. We'll do part 3, the final part, next time. Find out where this actually ends up going, because now I'm not so sure. Now I have no idea. What did happen to Mary Jo? I'm not so sure. I actually don't think this guy did it. That would be too obvious. Even before we knew, he probably didn't. But then what did happen? I guess we'll have to wait and see. Obviously she's not fine because no one ever told the police that they had found her. Unless she went into hiding or something and she's actually alive. I don't know. Or someone else killed her or something. I don't know. We'll see. Thank you guys for listening. I will do part 3 soon enough. See you then.